With us now, Dana, Congressman Mark Green, a Republican out of Tennessee, former Army Special Ops flight surgeon, taken many flights on board the Black Hawk. Sir, good morning to you.
Good morning, guys.
Piecing this together, the plane was flying at about 400 feet. So that was just seconds before landing. And there's a question as to whether or not the pilots were flying in the helicopter with visual flight rules, which essentially allows a pilot in good weather conditions to use their own eyesight to fly. Can you, at the moment, help piece together what we think we're learning today?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is usually when these kinds of incidences occur, and I've done aircraft investigations. The flight surgeon is a part of that investigation team looking at the human factors, but it's usually multiple different errors that occur that all sort of line up to allow for something like this to happen. And, you know, whether or not these guys chose to use their night vision goggles, I mean, there's a lot of lights in that area, so it can sometimes make using the night vision goggles difficult. You're sort of on a threshold when you make that decision about the amount of ambient light from the ground in the air. So that's something we'll have to make a determination on. You know, one of the things that struck me is as a training flight, as a checkout ride, there was probably an instructor pilot, a very senior pilot, you know, in one of the sides of the cockpit, and then another pilot getting checked out on their annual, night flight or whatever the particular evaluation was. So this was not some basic training pilot flight from Fort Rucker. These were experienced aviators doing their check for the year.
Sir, listen to air traffic control sound from last night.
Did you see that? Go around, climb, maintain 3,000. Black Check 3, can you return to base? Black Check 3, proceed directly to Glebe. I need you to land. I need you to land immediately. Can you go to Dulles for a few minutes? Can you go to Baltimore?
And I'm sure you're familiar with these types of things. Like those planes land one right after the other. It's a very busy airport.
Yeah, that corridor is probably one of the most, it's certainly one of the busiest, but it's also one with a lot of radars and deconfliction to protect of course, the White House and the Capitol building. I mean, the ability to deconflict that airspace is probably the best in the country, maybe in the world. So understanding how they collided is still a big question. That should not have happened. And of course, we've got to look into that and the technology on the aircraft that was used.
Speaking of your exact comment there, Sean Duffy said something very similar just about 2 hours ago.
I think whether it was air traffic control, whether it was military aircraft, helicopters, or the American flight, everything was standard in the lead up to the crash. Those who live in the D.C. area, we see military helicopters fly up and down the river. It's a standard path that they fly. They're used to aircraft landing at DCA, and there's a procedure in place because this happens every day. Something went wrong here.
Something indeed went terribly wrong. Sir, it's our understanding that air traffic control had communicated with the helicopter within 30 seconds. And they said, do you have the CRJ in sight, meaning the American Airlines flight? And again, seconds later, please pass behind the CRJ. Now, what we don't have is whether or not there was communication with the helicopter pilots themselves, because apparently that is not recorded. I didn't know that was standard operating procedure, but maybe you have some more insight on that for us.
It's a different frequency. So the military aircraft typically are on the UHF, depending on the type of aircraft. I flew on the special operations aircraft, so those had satellite, they had everything. But, a standard Army aircraft is probably just communicating on the UHF, and that frequency, so the air traffic controller has two different frequencies to talk on when he's deconflicting. Obviously, we'll dig into that, but that aircraft would have been on a different freak. And whether or not it was actually recorded, I'm sure it's recorded. It'd be recorded in the Black Hawk's, black box, so to speak. So we'll get answers.
The American Airlines CEO spoke as well. Listen here.
American Eagle Flight 5342, operated by PSA Airlines, traveling from Wichita, Kansas to Reagan National Airport, was involved in an accident just before 9 p.m. local time on final approach into Reagan National. They collided with a military aircraft on an otherwise normal approach. And at this time, we don't know why the military aircraft came into the path of the PSA aircraft.
So when you said that as a flight surgeon, one of the things you are involved in is investigations of these types of crashes. So what would be the first three questions you would want to get to?
Well, from my standpoint, is just the status of the pilots. Were they on, did they have any illnesses? We would, of course, take blood samples and things like that. But, those things I think are sort of secondary, the flight surgeon's role in it. The real question is what did ATC say and when did they say it? What deconfliction? I mean, there's technology, collision technology on the aircraft. Did any of those, were they functioning? Did they not sound the alarm? The pilots, there was an aircraft that was taking off just prior to the landing of the flight that, was the collision occurred with, the Wichita flight. And it's very possible, in the 3 dimensions of space or, in the air, that the Black Hawk pilots got target fixation on the aircraft taking off and maybe thought, okay, we're well behind that aircraft, and weren't aware that there was another one that was coming in for a landing. That's very possible. But I've dealt with crashes where target fixation from the pilot was the cause of the crash. So maybe they thought they were well behind it. They saw the aircraft that was taking off and didn't evade, and then
it's possible. And a lot of this is speculation right now. Maybe you can clarify two things for us here. The collision avoidance system, a TCAS system. Is it true that at a certain altitude it's not an operation? Like if you're close to the ground, you don't want. I mean, you could pick up just about anything you'd imagine there. Is that the case? And number two, if you're flying that helicopter at night on a clear night sky, what would you see emit from that airplane, the passenger plane? What sort of lights would you be looking for or be able to see?
Of course, the aircraft has wing lights. It has a nose. I would assume as it's coming in for a landing, they typically have a very bright nose light, spotlight on. And of course tail lights. So it's pretty hard to miss it. But again, think about the way a Black Hawk cockpit is. If it's actually ascending and the other aircraft is descending, the view up requires the crew chief to actually stick his head out of the aircraft and look up. And so the pilots, they're up. Visual field is limited. They have great visual field down. They're a helicopter. They're built for, fighting wars close to the ground, but looking up, not so much.
And on the collision avoidance system, is that ever disengaged?
Not to my knowledge, Bill. I was on special operations aircraft that had some capabilities that exceed what the regular Army had. I do not know if there's, turns itself off.
Okay.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be in touch with you.